welcome to Crime Time 911. So today's case is about David Russell Williams. He was a success story on paper. He was a decorated Royal Canadian Air Force colonel. He was a commander at CFB Trenton. He was a trusted VIP pilot who flew many high government officials and even royalty. But he was living a secret double life that nobody would ever suspect. So let's start at the beginning. Russell was born on March 3rd, 1963 in England. His parents would later immigrate to Canada. His parents would separate when he was fairly young. His mother would then remarry later on in life. He was described as intelligent, organized, and somewhat reserved. He attended the University of Toronto, where he was also disciplined and very serious about his work. At this time in Russell's life, nobody saw any red flags. Everything was great. He had a bright future ahead of him. Russell would join the Canadian Forces in the late 1980s, where he was known for his professionalism and attention to detail. So he did very well in the Air Forces. He did so well, he quickly flew up the ranks. I don't know much about military in general, so I don't know how long it would typically take for people to be able to, be promoted through different ranks, but he apparently did exceptional. Everybody loved him. He was so good. And he was promoted fairly quickly. And as mentioned earlier, he was the pilot to the VIP aircraft, which again, he transported high government officials, important people, royalty, all the important people that would need to travel with the protection of the military. He was even deployed to Canada's mission in Afghanistan in a support troop. He received decorations, including the Southwest Asia Service Medal and Canadian Forces Decoration, which would later be revoked. In July of 2009, he was appointed commander at CFB Trenton, which is a very prestigious and highly visible post. CFB Trenton was central to Canadian military operations, including ceremonies for fallen soldiers. Russell often appeared in uniform at public solemn events, portraying himself as disciplined and, honorable. Colleagues and his neighbors saw him as very polite and controlled. So, I guess you kind of would need to be controlled to be a part of the military. I guess that's sort of what they train you to do. But again, like I said, there's no red flags. He seems like the typical military person, typical, neighbor, family member, friend, no red flags at all at this point, basically. It's suspected that his crime started in 2007, starting with a series of fetish-motivated break-ins in small Ontario communities such as Tweed and Orleans. He would enter the homes, often while the women were away. He would steal or arrange their underwear. He would even photograph himself wearing the items that he stole. So, you as a woman, whether you're married, single, whatever, you trust that when you come home and you lock that door, that's your safe haven. You let down all your guard. You don't expect anybody to be in the home that shouldn't be there. You hear of break-ins all the time, but everybody always has that mentality of like, it couldn't happen to me. But in reality, it could very well happen to any of us. But again, like when you're at home, that's supposed to be your safe space. That's supposed to be where you're the most vulnerable, where you can relax, where you can, let your guard down and do whatever makes you comfortable. Later on, investigators would link Russell to multiple, many break-ins. The total number of victims related to the break-ins that Russell had been responsible for was estimated to be over 80 women. That's a lot of break-ins, a lot. And how did he go on for so long? Obviously, he started in 2007, and he didn't escalate his crimes until 2009. So that's a lot of break-ins in 2 years to, victimize 80 women. That's huge. And how did he never become on the radar before this? It is so strange to me, how he was able to do that and still stay under the radar so well. Like I said, in 2009, his crimes would escalate and it would go from the simple fetish break-ins to physical assaults, physical attacks. So now he didn't wait for the women to leave before he broke in. Now he waited for them to be home. So again, you're in your safe spot. You are letting your guard down, and all of a sudden there's this man in there attacking you. I'm sure it catches them off guard, so they don't even have a minute to even try to, get help or defend themselves. He committed at least 2 home invasions in the Tweed area in which he bound, blindfolded, and essayed his victims. He photographed and filmed the entire events, which is risky because that's evidence against yourself. So I know that a lot of criminals like to do that stuff so that they can relive the crime and relive the situation over and over again. But that's still pretty risky because in the event that you're caught, there's no way to deny that. There's evidence to show that you did this stuff. So even though Russell had broken in many, many times to many different houses and he essayed a bunch of women, he was only responsible for 2 unalivings. So we're going to talk a little bit about those victims. The first person that he unalived was Corporal Marie France Comier, who was 37. She was also a member of the Canadian Forces. She was an Air Force flight attendant. She also worked on the VIP flights and was based out of Trenton. So this is somebody that Russell likely knew because he was the pilot of the VIP flights. So I'm sure they crossed paths many times, especially with being out of the same military base. In November of 2009, Russell would break into Marie's home near Brighton, Ontario. He attacked Marie over an extended period of time, just dragging out the assaults and the brutality and, his pleasure, her torture, basically, right? She was restrained, essayed, physically attacked. It was not a good situation whatsoever. And of course, in Russell's, true fashion, he documented the whole thing through photographs and filming. Marie would later be found in her home unalived. At that time, there was no suspects. The police didn't know who did this. They didn't even know that the fetish break-ins that they were already investigating, they didn't even know that they were linked to this unaliving of Marie. So he broke into Marie's home. He, brutalized her in the worst possible ways, recorded the whole thing, and then took her life. But she wasn't his only victim that suffered in that way. Then we have Jessica Lloyd, who was 27 and lived near Belleville, Ontario. She was known as being warm, social, and close to her friends and family. On January 28, 2010, Russell would break into Jessica's home at night while she's sleeping. So again, she's completely caught off guard. No opportunity to be able to call 911 or escape or, even defend herself, try to fight off her attacker. He, broke in at the most vulnerable times. He also did the same thing he did to Marie. He restrained her, he essayed her. And then eventually, after, brutalizing her within her own home, this time, instead of just unaliving her and leaving her in her home, he took her to his cottage in Tweed. He abducted her basically, and continued to assault her when he was at the cottage. So I don't know how long she went through all this brutality and this, torture. But I imagine it was for quite a while, especially because he abducted her from her home where somebody could eventually come and knock on the door to his cottage in a remote area where he felt comfortable and safe so that he can continue this assault on this poor victim. Eventually, he would unalive her as well and disposed of her remains in a very remote location. Jessica would eventually be the link or the turning point in Russell's secret life, but we'll get to those details later. So the OPP was already dealing with the string of unsettling crimes of, the break and enters, the stealing of women's lingerie, home invasions, essays, all the things. And then all of a sudden they discover Marie's body. Now, all of these cases, they didn't know were linked at the time. So they were all being handled separately. One investigation for the break and enters, one investigation for the essays, and another investigator for Marie's case. However, eventually they would see that the patterns were hard to ignore, that, geography overlapped, time overlapped, and the suspect's behavior suggested that this was one person responsible for all of these crimes. However, nothing at this point pointed to the decorated military officer. So they knew that one person was responsible for all these, but they had no idea who. And I'm sure they had no idea that they would end up, that it would point into the direction that it ended up going. The turning point came from a very simple detail: tire tracks found behind Jessica's house. So, the police are doing their investigation. They're going around outside. They're, looking for clues. And in the ground outside, in the snow outside, are very clear tire impressions. So they photograph it or, take a cast of it, whatever they do to document that evidence. And these tires were so distinct that they were able to narrow it right down to a specific make of tires. So that's huge, in investigation. It gives them exactly what they're looking for. So now they just have to figure out who would own a vehicle that would have these tires. This is when the OPP set up a massive roadside canvas on Highway 37. So this was the main route between Belleville and Tweed. So every car that passed through that checkpoint, the officers would stop the vehicles, photograph the tires, and recorded every vehicle that passed through. On January 29, 2010, a Nissan Pathfinder would roll through the checkpoint. The driver was polite, calm, and very cooperative. Nothing, suspicious about him. He didn't seem nervous. He seemed very relaxed, just kind of like everybody else that went through the checkpoint, right? So this driver would identify himself as Colonel Russell Williams, the commander at CFB Trenton. So I'm sure at the time that the officers thought, oh, he's a colonel. He's a colonel at CFB Trenton. So they probably didn't really think anything of it. They just, did the routine because they had to and then sent him on his way. Later on, the tires found on Russell's Pathfinder would be compared to the tracks that they found behind Lisa's residence. The tread pattern was consistent, so they knew these tires on Russell's Pathfinder were the exact same tires that were at Jessica's house. Now, did they make the link? Was this just, was this when they kind of thought, this guy could be our suspect, or were they just thinking like, is this just a huge coincidence? I'm not sure. But eventually, because of this detail and because this was the only vehicle in the area that had matched these tire tracks, they had to investigate. So they start treading lightly, of course. They don't accuse him, they don't confront him, they just do methodical background check because, of course, he's a big high-ranking officer in the military. The last thing they want to do is start accusing somebody without concrete evidence. Officers would start by examining Russell's schedule at the base, would check his travel patterns, checked where he lived, checked where he stayed on the weekends, whether he had any connections to any of the victims. What they found was very unsettling and I'm sure probably pretty shocking, coming from a military commander. This is when they discovered that Russell's cottage was in Tweed, where at least 2 women had been essayed. He had no solid alibi for the night of those attacks. His movements aligned with the timelines of the break-ins in Orleans. He had been in the area where Marie had been unalived. There was just too many links that they were discovering to ignore. So on February 7th, 2010, police would ask Russell to go to the OPP detachment in Ottawa for an interview. And he agreed. No hesitation, no attempts to avoid the meeting. I'm guessing just like any arrogant criminal, he thought he could, walk in there, project his typical demeanor that he projects to everybody, and they would be like, okay, it's no possible way that this guy could be involved in these attacks. Probably just a huge coincidence, and let him go. I'm sure that's what he was probably thinking at the time that he agreed to go in to do these interviews. However, he didn't know of the solid evidence that they've had linking him to the crimes as of yet, right? Detective Sergeant Jim Smythe conducted the interview. Smythe was known for his calm, almost gentle interrogation style. So he wouldn't go in there, like a bull in a china shop, like you see on TV. He wouldn't go in there just automatically accusing people being aggressive or anything like that. His style of interrogation was a method to build rapport. He was patient. He applied psychological pressure. Rather than, confrontation, like I said before. The interview was routine. They asked background questions. They made small talk. It was a very slow, deliberate build up to the climax, up to the point where they were going to really reveal their cards, so to speak. So Smythe and Russell are, Smythe is asking questions, Russell's answering. They have like little small chit chat, like I mentioned before, just, building a rapport, building the trust. And then eventually Smythe introduces the evidence. He tells Russell about the tracks behind Jessica's home and how they are very, very distinctive tire tracks. He explains to Russell how they documented his vehicle when he rolled through that checkpoint that one day, and that forensic experts were already analyzing the comparison between his vehicle's tires and the tracks they found behind Jessica's home. The detective didn't accuse Russell. He just let the silence do the talking. So he laid out all the evidence, basically how it was linked to him, and just, let Russell make his own conclusions. Eventually, Russell's composure began to break. He asked about search warrants. He asked how long the process would take, asked what would happen next. All these questions that he was asking was not that of an innocent person. So he was basically trying to figure out like how long he had to figure out his next move, I guess. And, we all know that any innocent person would be denying it, would be, raising some other serious questions like, do you have any suspects? Like, why are you looking at me? Being a little bit more concerned. But he was more concerned about, I'm guessing, like figuring out what his next story was, how he was possibly going to try to figure out how to get himself out, or maybe just how much time he had before he was actually going to be locked up. Within hours, Russell's facade began to collapse. He eventually confessed. So first he confessed in, little fragments, little truths here and there. And then all of a sudden, the dam broke and everything began to flood. He told everything. He tells them about the break-ins. He tells them about the essays. He tells them about Marie-France Comier. And eventually he tells them about Jessica Lloyd. He also told the investigators where they can find Jessica's body, because at this point they hadn't found it yet. They didn't know that he had taken her to his cottage. So they probably weren't really looking for her there. So he, thankfully, because a lot of people that do these kinds of things, they keep that secret. That's like their secret, their last attempt to control the situation and, control the victims' lives, basically, their friends, the family, the police. So he was at least decent. I don't like the word decent, but at least he was decent enough to be able to give Jessica's family that closure in locating her body. So the double life that Russell had been carrying out for years was exposed in one night. So he spent years upon years upon years, being this ideal military commander while secretly conducting all of these horrific crimes. And his whole secret double life was exposed in a matter of hours. I'm sure that was, shocking to Russell. And I can't even imagine how shocking or how shocked the OPP would have been when they realized that like this highly respected military person could commit such horrific crimes. Like, you join the military to protect people, to protect your country. You don't join the military and then commit a series of horrific crimes. Like, it's crazy. In October of 2010, Russell would appear in a court in Belleville. The proceedings were open to the public, so the courtroom was packed with journalists, reporters, friends, family, you name it, everybody was there. Over 4 days, the court heard the full scope of his crimes, so all the details. The Crown presented the evidence that the investigators had recovered, thousands of photographs documenting the break-ins, images and videos of the essays, hours of footage of the unalivings of Marie and Jessica, organized digital folders cataloging victims, dates, and stolen items. So he kept track of the names of the victims, the dates that he assaulted them or broke into their house, and what he stole from their houses. Like, that's That is crazy. In addition to all of that, there was boxes of lingerie and personal belongings taken from the dozens of homes that Russell had broken into over the years. Members of both Marie and Jessica's families read victim impact statements. They spoke of the lives that were cut short, the futures that were stolen, the unbearable weight of knowing that their loved ones had suffered at the hands of someone who was supposed to be their protector. Russell would plead guilty to 2 counts of first degree, 2 counts of SA and forcible confinement, dozens of break-and-enter charges, multiple counts related to voyeurism and theft. The judge would sentence Russell to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years for each unaliving. So basically, life in prison times 2 without the possibility of parole for 25 years. And then he had additional concurrent sentences for the SAs and the break-ins as well. So I don't know the exact details, but there are 2 different ways that when you're sentenced to when you have multiple different sentencings for different parts of crimes, you can serve them concurrently or consecutively. So I believe concurrent means that they're to be to be served side by side, basically, instead of, doing his first 10 years and then the next 10 years. It's all kind of done side by side. However, because he was charged with 2 counts of life imprisonment, even with the possibility of parole, he's not likely to be granted that parole because of the horrific crimes that he committed. So chances of Russell ever leaving prison are very, very slim, and hopefully he'll serve the rest of his life in prison. So what do you think about this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. Thank you for watching To Crime Time 911. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember to always trust your gut.